This is APCO Forum, powered by APCO Worldwide, an advisory and advocacy communications firm. Now, here's your host, John Defterius.
Hello and welcome to APCO Forum, timely conversations catalyzing progress on global topics. I'm John Defterius of APCO Worldwide. In this series, we're following the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, or UNGA, or UNGA. It's a great convening point for global leaders to focus on the major issues of today. In parallel with these meetings, APCO experts and guests will be engaging in discussions to uncover insights that help unpack the issues at play. And to kick off today's discussion on food security, let me welcome in the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman. He is the chairman of the International Advisory Council for APCO Worldwide. Dan, it's great to have you. With your experience on Capitol Hill, also at the Department of Agriculture for the United States, give us a sense at this UNGA how you see the major issues of the week, but advancing that agenda for 2022 at the same time.
Well, first of all, thank you, John, and thanks to APCO for arranging this. So I would say 4 or 5 things quickly. It's great that food and food security is highlighted in the agenda of UNGA and the UN Food Systems Summit. For years and years, food and agriculture were relegated to what I believe was an unimportant role, and that is changing because of its significance in global politics. And so this conversation is very timely indeed. So if you were to ask me what are the 2 or 3 or 4 things that are really key here, one, in the era of COVID, it's going to affect everything we're talking about in terms of food and food security. But number one, of course, is access, particularly in the developing world, access to food in the period where we have hunger and malnutrition afflicting vast segments of the developing world. So access to food. Second would be climate. Climate and sustainability. Climate is having great impact. We've seen fires all over the world because of drought and heat and excessive floods like we saw in New York City. And that's happening throughout the world as well. And how we're able to provide a supply of food and keep the supply chains going with climate being so unpredictable. And the third thing is nutrition. So we talk a lot about the volume and calories of food, but the relationship between health, nutrition, medicine, and agriculture have been an underappreciated area. And so many people have serious medical diseases, from diabetes to cardiovascular diseases to other things, as a result of us not paying enough attention to nutrition. So those would be 3 of the topics I think would be worthy of this further discussion.
Great, Dan. Thanks for the nice introduction here. And I want to bring in Devry Boughner of Vorwerk, who's the founder and CEO of Devry BV Sustainable Strategies. She worked for years in the time that I knew her at Cargill, the global food giant, and also at Grubhub as well at the start of 2021. Devry, let's bring in this idea of the gender gap. And I want to highlight also the COVID-19 pandemic. Does it make it even worse when it comes to food security because of the supply chains that Dan was talking about in his intro here being broken during the pandemic?
Hi, John. Thank you. And it's a delight to also be here with you, Mr. Secretary. What you rightly point out, John, that what COVID brought to the forefront is the role of women in food and agriculture, and also the impact, the outsized impact that events like a pandemic or climate-based events can have on women. Women produce anywhere between 50 to 60 to sometimes in some places 70% of the world's food. So not only are they bearing the burden of ensuring that we have a secure food supply, at the same time they're the caregivers, they're often the leaders in their community. They are focused on ensuring nutrition for their young children and for children in the community. And so what we saw during COVID was that in addition, they're also employed in the food sector. So as the pandemic took hold, women were disproportionately impacted. One, from, as Dan mentions, an access standpoint, but 2, a lot of women were bearing the burden of trying to maintain their roles in society, in jobs, and at the same time ensuring childcare, et cetera. They've had an outsized and disproportionate impact. And I'm pleased to see that over the course of the year, the United Nations Food Systems Summit apparatus has prioritized not only women, but other vulnerable communities such as youth and indigenous people and smallholders to ensure that we are focused on those that are actually most instrumental in our food supply chain.
You know, Dan, you built a track record in my early days as a journalist on Capitol Hill in your 18 years in Congress of being bipartisan, a collective approach to policy. And I sat down with a diplomat in the past week here in London who said, geez, things are broken when it comes to international organizations. So what does it mean for rebooting the United Nations and giving the right attention to food security and the distribution chains that we're talking about? And that would even include, as you know, the World Trade Organization lowering barriers to make sure that food supplies can go in and out of countries during this critical window.
Well, first of all, it's a great question. And there is no question that right now food security is an extraordinarily high priority. And COVID has had a remarkably negative impact in terms of not only supply chains, as you've talked about, but by and large, food and food security have been more bipartisan in the United States than most other issues. And that's a positive thing in terms of passage of the Farm Bill, in terms of support for the UN World Food Program. The United States maintains great bipartisan support for helping hungry people around the world. I mean, we see so much toxic partisanship in almost everything. But when it comes to helping hungry people around the world, the U.S. has managed to avoid the deep partisan schisms that we've seen in other areas. And we just got to keep that going as well. And we also have to keep food security issues at the top of the global agenda. And so that's why it's so important that both political parties in America align on these issues.
Devry, you have years of experience at Cargill, both in China and India, exposure to Latin America. And you feel very passionate about this idea that the corporate world needs to be engaged when it comes to food safety and security, especially during this uncertain window of time that we're living in this period of history. What does that mean when you say corporate responsibility when it comes to the food sector?
Well, I appreciate the question. And to follow on from the institutional question you just asked, Dan, as it relates to the opportunity we have around the UN Food Systems Summit, it's actually been quite controversial, John, that corporations have been involved, and in fact, my view is that they have not been involved enough. And what I mean by that is that the traditional food industry players, that come together to address the global supply chains, the food security issues, the standards, the safety, the access, they're at the table. And also some small and medium enterprise folks are at the table. But where I think there's great opportunity for more corporate involvement is beyond some of those traditional players. When we think about the impact that the technology sector and some of these tech platforms have on the distribution of food, when we think about financial services or the transportation industry or the broader manufacturing industry or even telecom, where I see a great opportunity is that we get a broader cross-section of companies, corporate leaders at the table to put food security squarely at the center. I often like to say that companies, in global companies that invest all over the world in places like India and China and Brazil and in the United States, they cannot operate in failed states. And the most critical component to the basic building block to a secure state is food security. And so I often ask, why don't we reach out beyond the traditional players? And so I think that there are players at the table right now as part of the Food Systems Summit, but our great opportunity is to take the agenda and the outcomes that are coming out of this summit, John, and find a way to bring additional players and accountability of those players to the table.
I wanted to add one other element to this, and this is the cost of food around the world, the inflation that we're seeing. Dan, I remember the days of when I was in university with Paul Volcker trying to stamp out inflation in the early 1980s. We're not at that level, but if you look at the basket for common goods all around the world, developing world and the developed world, it's probably an inflation of 10 to 15% when it comes to foodstuffs. How do you tackle that challenge at the same time?
Well, it's certainly a global effort. We've seen, I just saw this morning's news stories that food prices are going up, not only in the United States, but globally. And a lot of that is the impact on COVID on supply chains. A lot of that has to do with famine and weather problems and climate-related issues. I did want to mention to what Devry, she made a very interesting point about involving others. You know, Napoleon said, war is too important to be left to the generals. And it strikes me that food policy is too important just to be left to people in the food industry. It affects everybody in this world, from politicians to people in the manufacturing sector, having an effective workforce, and of course technology issues, which we haven't talked about yet. And so it is really great that the UN is focusing on this topic in a much broader perspective than only just farmers and consumers. And they're very important. Agriculture is obviously very, very important in this mix, but there are a lot of other players who are also very important.
In the spirit of COP26, let's get both of you to comment on this. There are some concerns that there's some real log jams when you have droughts and the floods that Dan was talking about earlier, Devry. How do you fit the food equation into the COP26 talks? It's vital, is it not, to make sure we get an agreement that has some real teeth on it?
It absolutely, it's not only vital in terms of the impact that the climate discussions have on our ability to produce food, but also the impact that production of food has on the climate. So it is central to the discussion. And frankly, where we will get these commitments among governments is really important as it relates to CO2 reduction, combating and actually eliminating deforestation. That's going to be critical. Where I see the opportunity in the food space, and it is popping up going forward post-COP, post the COP26, is that we're starting to see voluntary, efforts like voluntary carbon markets popping up. You will pick that up in every, newspaper of the day. And you're seeing large players outside of the food industry starting to, develop carbon trading desks. The big challenge will be, can we expedite not only the commitments, but the action toward these commitments fast enough to reduce carbon in a way that's not going to impact our ability to produce food? So it should be, as Dan and I would naturally say, at the top of the agenda. Our ability as a global society to secure our food supply is absolutely dependent on our ability to address the broader climate change agenda.
Dan, would you weigh in on this, what Devry's talking about? Because I'm getting very concerned that many people are talking about multiple paths on COP26, which kind of could be, I need more leeway in the developing world to have a longer roadmap ahead, and then does that forestall any real progress from the developed world? It sounds a little bit dangerous, and the U.S. and China are not on the same page entirely here when it comes to climate change.
First of all, I concur with what Devry said, but the old phrase, let 1,000 flowers bloom? Well, unfortunately, when it comes, quite frankly, to a lot of United Nations activities, everybody wants to do their own thing. And when you have too many flowers bloom, nothing blooms. So one of, I think, my points is what COP needs to focus is on some specifics, some specific deliverables. For example, technology is going to be our friend in solving a lot of problems in terms of pest resistance, resistance to carbon emissions. And so we have to look at technology as a friend and not as an enemy. And that has sometimes happened in recent years. So a specific example is water. 70% of the water in the world is used to irrigate crops and feed animals. 30% is for everything else, drinking water, industrial use of water. We're going to have to find, and the people who are going to be hurt most by this clash between the use of water in urban and rural areas are people in the developing world, and also farmers who need water so desperately to produce their crops. So water and technology are a couple of areas that I hope that COP is able to try to facilitate agreements between both the developing and the developed world. The danger in COP is we get too many ideas and they are so general that nobody's going to be able to follow them. That's what worries me the most.
Okay, I have one question for each one of you. For you, Devry, it's genetically modified foods, not accepted in the European Union in a great way? Can they become the norm to solve the security problem?
Absolutely. Technology will be a huge part of us getting out of the insecurity issue. And my prediction is that over time, with enhanced conversations and real engagement, not just education of consumers, but engagement of consumers around the benefits of technology, 10 years from now, we won't be having the same controversial conversations. GMOs will be a critical component of addressing, as Dan mentioned, the water usage issues, et cetera. But also, it will be a critical component in addressing things like going from meat production, traditionally just animal-based agriculture, to also folding in other opportunities around plant-based, et cetera. That's all taking place. I'm an optimist that the technology will be something that we can actually converse and engage consumers and invite them to the conversation, as opposed to impose the topic on them.
Dan, overpopulation, it's a thorny issue, a sensitive one in certain parts of the world, but this does play into the overall narrative of food supplies and demand.
Well, obviously, education has a lot to do with the issue of overpopulation. And in societies that are educated, especially where girls are educated, provided the opportunities, you tend to see some of these issues better resolved. It also will take bilateral and multilateral discussions between the U.S. and China and other countries to try to work on this population issue. And one final point is the whole issue of food waste. We throw away about a third of all the food that we produce in this world. In the U.S., we throw it away because of affluence. In the rest of the world, they throw it away for a lot of other reasons, including spoilage and not having refrigeration and not having kinds of electricity. So that relates to the whole issue of population, in terms of the fact that if we could find ways to deal more effectively with food waste, the population explosion might be a little more workable.
Dan, that's a very good point to wrap up the APCO Forum here. Dan Glickman, the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and former member of Congress in the United States, and Devry Vorwerk, the founder and CEO of Devry BV Sustainable Strategies, joining us within this forum, which we hope serves as a catalyst for progress for corporations around the world on the key issues and the challenges in this unusual period in history. Join us on the APCO Forum from this point forward. Sign up for our newsletter and podcast, of course, and follow us on our social media channels at APCO Worldwide. I'm John Defterius. Thanks for joining us.